So a couple of quick things. First, thanks to the organizers for inviting me. And then sarcastically, thanks to the organizers for putting me in the zone of death right after lunch. So I promise, you may not like my presentation, but I promise I'll be very loud and animated. I always change the title of my presentation just as an act of cruelty to the organizers. But as I was putting it together, I thought more of the message I'm hoping to leave you with is, how can you start a risk assessment in a way that helps you finish it? So that's the theme of the presentation today. I'm Andrew Roberts. I'm the CEO of something called the Agriculture and Food Systems Institute, which tells you nothing interesting about me. I always have to start with a disclosure slide. Fortunately, I have no conflicts in giving this presentation. All of our work on animal biotechnology is funded by USDA. I would encourage you and be thrilled if you went to our website to learn more about the organization, including where our money comes from. I'm going to give a very short introduction to myself and my organization, and then I'm going to start with some very high-level context for risk assessment. So what is it? Why do we do it? What is our experience with it? Bring it to regulatory assessment, and then talk a little bit about problem formulation, which is the unfortunate name for a very fortunate process of scoping your assessment in a way that helps you complete it. And then I'm going to follow it up with what I hope will be a light example of how these processes work. So this is a picture of a thinner me at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. I'm a scientist by training. I actually did my PhD research in animal biotechnology, but on C. elegans. So nobody's eating it, and it really has little to do with our topic here, other than that molecular biology is the same for everyone. I spent some time at the US Department of Agriculture doing a bunch of different things, but all related to biotechnology, risk assessment, and international affairs before joining what is now AFSI at the end of 2009, more or less to manage our programs on capacity building and convening scientists to talk about risk assessment for biotechnology. So a lot of meetings very much like this one, and then some efforts to work with governments to help them understand what they're trying to accomplish with their risk assessment. This is AFSI. I'm going to skip this part. I love my organization, but I have 15 minutes to talk to you. Just do me a favor, and if anyone from my board of trustees asks, I did an excellent job of giving you the hard sell on AFSI. We're a nonprofit scientific organization that does work like this. Okay, so risk assessment. Nobody wakes up one day in middle school and says, you know what I want to do for a living? I want to be a risk assessor. But many of us find ourselves here. And a lot of people engaged in risk assessment come from a scientific research background, which can be helpful in some ways and very unhelpful in others. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So the good news is people assess risk constantly. You assess risk when you get out of bed in the morning. You assess risk when you cross the street. You apply all of these methods that we'll talk about every day. You just do it without thinking about it. When you cross the street, you look both ways. You're collecting data on whether cars are coming or not. When you ride a bike, hopefully you put a helmet on. You're taking a risk mitigation measure based on your understanding of the risks of riding a bicycle. And the big one is you're going to hit your head and hurt yourself. So you do this all the time, and everybody does this all the time. So the good and the bad is we all come to the table with lots of experience in risk assessment and lots of preconceptions about what risk is. The challenge is these are all informal assessments, and the process you go through for crossing the street is similar, but it's not adequate for a regulatory risk assessment. So what do we need to do to get from there to where we want to go? Well, the first thing is, because our regulations are driven by law and supported by science, we need to understand what is risk. What do we mean? So my favorite definition is from the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator. Risk is the overall process of risk identification and risk characterization. It's lovely. It's perfect. It is a little self-referential. So first we have to ask, this is the definition of risk assessment. This is the definition of risk. So the chance of harm from an activity, right? What are the chances that something undesirable, harmful, bad, negative is going to happen as a result of something we do. And I just dwell on this a little bit because definitions of harm are an area where we really need to focus more of our attention. So why do we perform risk assessments? And I would argue that whether you're crossing the street or whether you're making an informed regulatory decision on a genetically engineered animal, you are always conducting a risk assessment to inform a decision. You're never just doing it because you're excited about the concept of risk. Maybe that person exists, but usually they're not in the audience for this talk. The difference is, for a regulatory risk assessment, you also need to satisfy the requirements of your regulations. And those vary from place to place, but they have some commonalities that we can talk about. Almost always, we also have to communicate our decision. And we have to communicate that to decision makers as well as to the general public. When we think about risk communication, we're always thinking of the general public, but in most jurisdictions, the risk assessors are technical people. They have technical credentials. They're biologists, they're ecologists, they're entomologists, but almost never is the decision maker an ecologist or an entomologist or an agronomist. So the very first person we need to communicate our assessment to is the decision maker. So we need to understand how to talk to normal people about the science that we use to inform our risk assessment. And then finally, of course, we also need to communicate this to the public and the many publics. Whatever your definition of public is, we have to communicate to them about the result of our risk assessment. So I'm going to talk to you about a process that's referred to as problem formulation. If you don't remember anything else, this is a scoping process that I believe provides a tool to help you accomplish your risk assessment and communicate it well to the decision maker, to the public, to your colleagues. So what does this look like? Well, the name comes from the philosophy of science, the great Karl Popper, who posited that science is a series of solutions to problems, not a series of answers to questions. So if you think that sounds pedantic, then probably you're not going to enjoy a philosophy of science course. But all I want you to take away from that statement is that I didn't name this process. So please don't raise your hand and say, can we call it something else? I would love to call it something else. This is what it's called. And we're talking about this part of the assessment and risk analysis process. This is a diagram from a publication that came out of my organization right before I joined it. You can find very similar diagrams from OGTR, from US EPA. Mostly I put this up here to point out that we're often guilty of overcomplicating simple things. There's a lot of arrows and boxes on this diagram. Problem formulation is the part that you do at the beginning, and you can get hung up on whether it's 2 steps or 4 steps or 5 steps. It doesn't matter. I like to divide it into a context and a definition stage, but really it's just a scoping process for what am I going to assess during this assessment. The key is when you're conducting this, you have to identify the problem you're trying to solve, and you have to be explicit and transparent. And by going through a formal problem formulation process, by doing this deliberately, not haphazardly or accidentally or without acknowledgement, doing it deliberately and writing it down, you create an explicit and transparent process. So problem context, this is the short version. It includes everything you know. So this is the concept of familiarity. We're here talking about animals and biotechnology. We know a lot about animals. We actually already know a lot about biotechnology. So the context is, what do we know? What is the organism we're thinking about? What do we have experience with it? And then also, what have we been asked to do? So what is our regulation asking of us? And typically the most important component of this is to identify your protection goals. If we're lucky, we have very refined operational protection goals. And that would be something like looking at plant pest risk, but sometimes we're given very broad protection goals. Biodiversity, conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. We all agree that we want to protect it, but what exactly we're trying to protect and how we accomplish that requires a little bit more refinement. And this is a process that you go through during the problem formulation step. So the second step is to take those assessment endpoints, those protection goals, and then the subject of your assessment, and define your problem. So you relate those two things together. How is it that an animal that has been genetically engineered or has been the subject of genome editing, how is it likely to interact? Is it likely to interact with the things that I'm trying to protect, or is it not? And putting those things together. So you do this, you can dress this up as a very technical process. It's not a research project. You are applying logic and reason, and your goal is to focus your time and energy on plausible, possible, potential interactions that might cause harm to your protection goals, and to get rid of implausible interactions, things that you know are not going to happen without you spending any time working on them. So this is easy for me to say. It's a little bit harder to do in real life. The other outcome of a problem formulation is identifying what information, and I say information specifically because it's data, it's also information in all of its forms. So publication, expert knowledge, what information do you need to know to make an estimate of risk? So when you start, you have a subject and you have a direction, which normally comes from your legislation and your regulations. And when you end, you have at least the beginning of your assessment plan that tells you, okay, I think these things are worth looking at. And what I need to know about each of those things is information that relates to this. So a simple way to do this is one of my favorite publications. It's by a guy named Alan Gray, who worked at the Center for Ecology and Hydrology. He just turned 80 a couple of months ago, so he's happily retired now. And he worked at ACRE, which was the UK committee that looked at genetic engineering. And he spent he was an author on the publication that produced that complicated diagram that nobody likes to read. And that's a very dense paper. So he spent some time deliberately trying to put this into terms that real people could understand. And he broke it into 4 questions. What do we care about? What do we not want to see harmed? Can we envision a way that that thing might be harmed by the decision we're planning to make? How can we assess the likelihood that that harm will be realized? And then the most important one, in the end, does it matter? Have we assessed something that we decide at the end, ultimately, it doesn't matter? What's the regulatory context? And is the likelihood and the magnitude of the harm meaningful to us in the end? So this is a great paper. It's published by ICGEB, and I certainly would encourage you to read it. So I only have a short amount of time. So I'm going to try and work through these concepts with an example. And I'm just going to pull something random out of the air. Imagine you're taking a trip. So imagine you've been asked to travel to São Paulo, which I just pulled at random, for a workshop on animal biotechnology. So again, random. As part of your authorization process, your boss asks you, give me a risk assessment of what's going to happen and maybe some harm that might come to you, so I can decide if it's a good idea for you to go or not. So we can walk through these series of questions just to illustrate some of the ideas behind how this process works. So the first question is, what are we trying to protect? So in my case, this idiot is who I'm trying to protect, thinner, pre-COVID Andrew. And you can say, okay, great. Now we know the subject. Well, how do we refine those goals? Well, I would like for this fellow to stay healthy, safe, comfort, generally at least a little bit important, and then also be able to go home at the end of the meeting. So you might come up with a different set of refined protection goals, but this is what I'll be using for my analysis. So then this is a step where a lot of people get stuck and stay forever, hypothesize potential harms. So it's important to go through some step where you have broad consideration of what might go wrong. It's equally important that you end it. So I came up with this list, maybe with a little help from my kids. Your list might be different, and that's fine. What's important is that I'm giving you this list. So if I've included something that shouldn't be on here, you can tell me, not that, that's wrong. If I've missed something that you think should be on here, you can tell me, no, you must also think about this other thing. So I've made it explicit by writing down what my considerations are. And then the first step is to get rid of the things that just don't merit consideration. So I'm going on the hunch that there's no polar bears in Brazil, although I admit I didn't look up any information on that. But I want to point to this one just to belabor, abducted by UFOs. So this is what we refer to as a speculative risk. There's no evidence anywhere that helps me do a risk assessment of whether I'm likely to be abducted by UFOs. So it's pointless to look at it. There are people in the world who care very deeply about this issue, but no matter how much effort I put into the assessment of whether I'm likely to be abducted by UFOs, those people will never be happy with the assessment that I've done. So you can make the connection yourself. We deal with some issues that are like this in risk assessment for GMOs. Okay, so discarding the ones that are obvious, let's go to ones that have some merit. So these are 3 animals that I know live in Brazil. You may agree with me that some of them are more dangerous than others. But what I can tell you for certain is that people have been harmed by these animals at some degree of frequency over time. The capybara may be less than the jaguar, but I'm certain someone's been bitten by a capybara, and I prefer not to be the first. So the point is, you're all laughing because it's silly for me to spend time worrying about this, but I can find data and start working on a very elaborate assessment of the likelihood of being attacked by a jaguar. Or I can just apply the logic that you've all applied in your heads while looking at this to say, look, I'm going to be in a conference room for 5 days. The number of people attacked by capybaras in conference rooms is low. And I'm willing to make that assertion without doing any research on the subject. I'm just going to tell you, I think this is unlikely to happen. But what I'm doing is I'm telling you, if you disagree with me, you can tell me at the end of the presentation that I should have collected more data about capybara attacks in conference rooms. But I'm not going to spend any more time on it. So you go to the next thing. So I included aviation disasters and lightning strikes. These are similarly real things. This happens. I was in Washington, D.C., where I live, and somebody was killed just a couple of weeks ago by lightning strike, very close to the White House. Actually, 3 people were killed. So it happens. But these things occur everywhere. They're incredibly difficult to predict, and there's not much I can do about them. There are some routine things that I incorporate into my day-to-day life, like I don't go outside in a thunderstorm. I don't get on an airplane if I don't know that it's an actual airline and I have some information that they operate safely. Fly-by-night airlines is not one that I fly. So there's not much that I can do about this. It's managed by a routine set of practices, and I don't need to address it further. I don't need to show you data about lightning strikes or airplane crashes to make this decision about whether I'm going to go to São Paulo. So this is just what I've told you. It's worth mentioning, yes, these things might happen to me here, but there's nothing I'm going to do about it. And there's nothing especially